are trying to testify via Zoom to testify. And so with that in mind, we just would note that they are visible. Senator Miller is via Zoom to testify. And so with that in mind, we just would note that they are visible. Senator Miller is participating via Zoom today, and he still is, he's visible to our screen here, and therefore he won't be able to offer comments, but he is considered present according to the rules. And with that, we will first go to the adoption of the minutes from our January. Will stand approved as presented. With that, we will turn to Senate File 105, Senator Drazkowski. Senator Drazkowski's testifier is visible on Zoom, but is not able to testify. But Senator Drazkowski has chosen to go forward with his bill. And with that, Senator Drazkowski, Senator Drazkowski's testifier is visible on Zoom, but is not able to testify. But Senator Drazkowski has chosen to go forward with his bill. And with that, Senator, welcome to the committee, and please present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Senate File 105 is a bill that, to be parallel to the way for homeowners, the way that we have in policy now, the property tax refund for the renter refund program. So in 2023, to the way for homeowners, the way that we have in policy now, the property tax refund for the renter refund program. So in 2023, it was adjusted, and the Roth IRA distributions are now not part of the calculation for household income for the property tax refund if you are applying for the PTR on the rental side. But it is part of the calculation of household income if you're considering the homeowner side. And my constituent, Fred Majerus, if he could join us today, would enlighten you to that. As a matter of fact, he did get a chance to testify on this bill last year. We did lay this bill over last year, and it seems to be gaining some momentum. And members, if we look at the bill, this part of statute around the PTR, the property tax refund program, is somewhat complicated in that the first part of the statute actually says that these things should be considered for household income, and the second part on page 3 says these things shall not. So the bill adjusts both sides of it in order to make it clear. And then on page 4 of the bill, you will see really kind of a belt and suspenders definition of Roth-style retirement account or plan to make it clear. As a matter of fact, I was just talking to Mr. Sylvia earlier, and we may even want to, at some point, make this statute a little easier to read. That's the bill, members. It would be about $180 per person for those that this impacts, $180 more of property tax refund that they would receive, and it would affect about 11,000 homeowners.
Very good. Thank you, Senator. Questions? Senator Rez.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Drazkowski. Question for you, but if not, maybe Senate Council can help. We passed this for renters, correct? Yeah. And I wonder, what was the revenue estimate, Mr. Sylvia or Ms. Pollack, in the 2023 bill?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rez, we need to look that up. The 2023 proposal moved the entirety of the renter's refund onto the income tax side, so it wasn't just specific to the distributions of Roth IRA. It was the entire renter's property tax credit being converted. So we'd have to look to see if we can sort of isolate that particular piece rather than the whole conversion itself.
It would be interesting if the department could parse that, just for information. And I don't have a sense of whether it was more expensive, or it cost more, or gave more relief to the renters than this estimate here, which I would say in normal times is not a whole lot. It may be by this year. And then on the revenue estimate itself, Senator Drazkowski, and maybe this is a change, or this is also a question for the department, and that is the last bullet point. What would cause a change like this to be not administrable for the current year? Did they explain that to you, or?
They did not,
Ms. Bars,
Madam
can
Chair.
she tell us, Ms. Bears? If you don't mind, she's present. May I ask her? What would the department, Ms. Bears, Mr. Chairman, what would the department have to do to make it administrable in the second year, if not the first year?
Ms. Bears.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Joanna Bears. I'm the Legislative Director at the Department of Revenue. That's a good question. I think it depends on when the bill is passed. So the property tax refund program is filed in August, but it's used, previous information. So I think some folks file in April or June when they get their property tax statement. And so it depends when the bill was passed is what would dictate whether or not it could be done. We have made changes previously to property tax refunds in the same year, so it would require folks to amend their return if we were to go with the fiscal year 26.
I see. Thank you.
Senator Rest and Ms. Bears, wouldn't it also go to the fact that we have changed the property tax where it now can be claimed on the return, which actually brings it about sooner rather than everyone having to wait till August?
Not for homeowners.
Not for homeowners, but for renters now.
Mr. Chair, I think that is a good question. On if you were to do it for homeowners, people are going to be filing their income taxes. And since the property tax refund would be on the income tax return, that would also require an amended return.
Very good. Any other questions? Senator Drazkowski, any final comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. Just quickly, so if Mr. Majerus were here today, he would say, you know what? When I put money into a Roth IRA, expected when I pulled distributions out, I was not going to be taxed on them. And then it took him some realization as he was examining the property tax refund and it not being as much of a refund as he expected, to come to the realization at that time, actually, in his mind, I would suspect, and if I was him too, that it appeared that he was being taxed at that point. So it's not congruent. It's certainly not parallel with the renter's side, but I think we want to endeavor to have tax policy that is clear and consistent to the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Drazkowski. With that, hearing no objections, this bill will be laid over for possible inclusion. And Senate File 105. We are next going to Senate File 34, Senator Rest.
Thank you.
Welcome to your committee. Please present your bill when ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I introduced a series of bills for this session that were taken, a lot of which were proposals that we heard last year and/or the year before that failed to make it into passage. And the language in most of them is identical with some minor amendments and/or which include updating the effective date. So I'll explain when that happens, and or you'll see them as they were amended and didn't get in, rather than just the introduced versions. And that happens with this. In 23, we had Senate File 2124, and with Senate File 34 for this year, there was one change in the presentation of the topic, and that is the order of the definitions. That's the only change that was made, and that's in lines, and then I'll go back over the bill, and that's in lines 113 through 115. Catering service defined was presented in the bill. The bill that we considered in 2023 later than the it is in this bill. So years ago, we spent during Governor Carlson's administration, we spent 3 or 4 years reducing and then eliminating the sales tax on capital equipment. And then at the end of that period, we made it a pure exemption, and we had spread it out over a few years, reducing it, a portion of it each year. Since that time, there's been a lot of discussion, and this bill reflects it, about really what the definition of capital equipment should be. And that generally we think of it as in a warehouse, not a warehouse, in a manufacturing facility. It is assets or machinery that can't be moved, that it's permanent in place, and so it is personal property rather than attached to the real estate tax to start with, and then it has, or it is still there, but then it is separated from regular purchase. And so we have been approached by the hospitality associations and advocates in industry for treating restaurants and food services with the same kind of exemption. So to begin with, in Section 1, it defines what is going to be exempt from the property, the personal property that is put in place in food services, whether it's a catering service or a restaurant, and that's in 47, subdivision 47, Section 1, with making the exemption in lines 1-8 through 1-11. And then, starting with lines 1-12, are the definitions of what we mean by this exemption, starting with a catering service, which is defined there. And then secondly, the definition of what exactly is going to be included in as food service equipment. And starts with machinery, equipment, fixtures, and supplies that are, again, just like with capital equipment for manufacturers, they're integral to the product that is that comes about because of being able to do that. And so, and then starting on lines 2.5, it indicates what things are not included. And that means linens, paper, and then starting on lines 2.5, it indicates what things are not included. And that means linens, paper, napkins, et cetera, the things that are just used by the consumer at that point, not attached to the business itself. And then another slight change from the 21-24 is in line 2.10, and that's because of changing the definitions around the order of them. The original bill had said on line 2.10, service as defined in this section, and it was changed here to read in this subdivision. It refers to prepared food, which is a definition that's in line 2.14. The definitions with regard to sales tax in 297A, and then the original effective date on lines 2.18 was June 30th, 2023, and we change it here to 2025. So I appreciate the members of the committee who have signed on with the bill, Senator Nelson, Senator Housechilds, Senator Dibble, and we have attempted to reach out to the hospitality industry in recognizing the kinds of costs that they have that should be exempt from the sales tax. The revenue estimate from March 2023 and the one that we have for the bill today are very similar, if not identical. And the for fiscal year 2024, if you look at the third bullet, the reason why there's a difference there between that and other years, even accounting for inflation, is that there would only be 11 months of collection rather than a full year for fiscal year 25, 26, and 27. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the bill and the history of it.
Thank you, Senator. We have Hannah Zinn, Director of Government Relations from Hospitality, Minnesota, who indicated a desire to testify. You would come forward.
Thank you for coming.
Well, welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record, and you may proceed when ready.
Wonderful. Good morning, Senator Weber, Senator Rust, and committee members. My name is Hannah Zinn, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for Hospitality Minnesota, which represents the state's restaurant, lodging, resort, and campground sectors and more. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of Senate File 34, the Food Service Establishment Equipment Exemption. In Minnesota, the hospitality industry makes up over 384,000 jobs, averaging about 12% of the state's total workforce. Our industry is comprised of businesses of varying sizes, operating models, and economic impact. The hospitality industry contributes $2.3 billion in annual tax revenue to the state and more than $8.1 billion in total labor income. Minnesota law provides a sales tax exemption for manufacturing equipment used to produce products later resold and taxed at the point of sale. Food service businesses are the only category of manufacturers required to pay the sales tax on their equipment purchases. Including for food service equipment in the capital equipment sales tax exemption will create tax equity, aid the hospitality industry in future economic success, and provide positive benefits like more investment in energy-efficient equipment. Given the current market conditions for the hospitality industry, this issue has moved beyond tax equity to contributing to the longevity of an industry that remains in need of support. According to recent quarterly survey findings fielded by Hospitality Minnesota, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and Explore Minnesota Tourism, over 60% of businesses say price inflation for goods and services is the biggest challenge to operation. Wholesale price hikes are still higher than final and retail prices. Hospitality Minnesota and the hospitality industry at large appreciates this legislation's positive move to be fair and equitable related to sales tax exemption. We look forward to serving as a resource for you on our shared goal of good public policy and economic success for hospitality businesses across Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zinn. Any questions? Senator Klein?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rest, I skipped ahead in the reading, and I see on your next bill that you have an amendment with regards to tax expenditures that preserves the 8-year sunset on new tax expenditures. But I noticed Senate File 34 does not preserve a sunset of any kind. Was that purposeful, or would there be an indication for an 8-year sunset on this provision?
Senator Rest?
Well, Mr. Chairman and Senator Klein, I considered actually bringing up Senate File 45 first, which makes changes in the Turk statute and the amendment that I have there. And the requirement of limiting a new tax expenditure to 8 years, you have to go back to the definition of a tax expenditure and what a new one is. And this one is not a new one. So that 8-year period would not be part of, would not require an 8-year sunset unless someone wanted to put it in the bill. I chose not to, and it is a mere, not a mere, maybe a significant extension, but indeed it is an extension of a tax expenditure that is already in place. And when we passed that in, I don't know, 2021 or 2021, we tried to really understand what that impact would be. And one of the other bills I have extends the sales tax exemption to trigger locks on guns, but it is part of an already existing tax expenditure for gun safes that we passed in 2023, specifically not including it in the list of sales tax exemptions which was going to be subject to the 8-year rule. And so by adding trigger locks, that's just an expansion of the same tax expenditure and is not considered a new tax expenditure. And you can think of other things that would come under a definition of a tax expenditure that is not, quote, a new one. And if it doesn't expire and you merely change it, there is not going to be that requirement that that change results in the 8-year sunset. So it's only if it's something totally brand new, or there is already an expiration that then you renew it afterwards. And that, you probably didn't want this lengthy explanation, but that faced us in 2023 when we had the historic tax credit that had expired in 2022, that when we reinstated it in 2023, what we passed was as if it had continued in that year. So we set the expiration date for the continuation or the reinstatement of an expired tax expenditure for that one to 7 years. And that was, working through all of the requirements with both with the department and with Senate Council and House Research. So this one is not new in the sense that it is just expanding the capital equipment sales tax exemption.
Thank you. Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Chair Weber, and thank you, Senator Rest, for bringing this bill and allowing me to join you on it. I represent a big hospitality industry region on the North Shore and outside of Duluth and certainly the whole Northland. And I had a friend who owns a restaurant in my district tell me that for those opening new restaurants, if you can't take a 2 or 3 year hit of losing money, not just breaking even, but losing money, you'll never make it. And I think we see that in the evidence of restaurants closing and opening shop back and forth and not really making it long term. In addition to that, in my region and I think across Minnesota, in my opinion, due to climate change, we're seeing some mild winters. And that's creating a really, really difficult shoulder season when folks are usually reliant on snowmobiles, ATVs, skiing, all the outdoor recreation that happens in the winter months outside of the summer when we're busy. And so this is a really, I think, important time for us to be addressing the hospitality industry and figuring out how we can work on these issues. Lastly, I would just add, I love win-wins. And we have heard a lot of talk about inflation, and rightfully so, particularly with food prices and restaurant prices. And I think if we can find a way through your bill to not only provide stabilization to the restaurant industry and our business owners, but also hope for those prices to then get passed down to the consumer in lower prices on the food, that to me seems like a really great win-win opportunity for us to address the inflation that we're seeing with food prices. So my hope is that we can get something done on this. Maybe it's not all of the exemptions we're asking for. Maybe there's a way to make it more digestible given the budget that we have. But I really, really do hope that we continue to look at this issue this session. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Chair, thank you for bringing this bill forward, and I am glad to join you on this.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Nelson, in this position, I'm just Senator Rest.
Senator Rest, thank you for bringing this bill forward. It's very important, obviously, to the hospitality industry. I also noticed the tax equity piece that you mentioned, and I think that is essential as well. But the effects of this are very important to our hospitality industry, and it is one of our very important industries in this state. And I believe in some cases has still been suffering from some of those COVID shutdowns. We lost a lot of restaurants, and as my colleague Senator Hochschild said, starting the restaurant industry is a very difficult industry to get started in, and for many reasons. Perhaps it has more regulations, more government entities looking at it than any other. But I think this is an important bill. I'm hoping that it does, again, come through the Senate, and also that we're able to get this across the finish line. So thank you for bringing this, and for the explanation about why it does not need the 8-year limitation, as it's not Turk-related. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman, it gave me something to do last night as I was watching Ohio State win the college championship. And I appreciate conversation also later on in the evening with Ms. Pollock as we tried to figure out how to explain how this is not a new tax expenditure. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Senator. If there are no further questions or comments, and you have nothing further, Senator Rest, with that, we will then lay Senate File 34 over for possible inclusion. With that, we will turn to Senate File 11. Senator Rest.
Mr. Chairman, the explanation about a tax expenditure, again, serves this bill as well. 2 years ago, we exempted from the sales tax the purchase of gun safes. And last year, I had a bill that extended that tax expenditure, so it was not a new one, to trigger locks, cable locks. And so it is returning to us today with no change in the language, except for last year, Senate File 3564. Its effective date was June 30th, 2024, and this year's bill comes to us with the amendment that we took in 2024, and that I really want to point out to you from Senator Drazkowski, that indicated that the purchase, I'm going to read this, but the purchase, information about the purchase or transfer of a safety device, a firearm storage unit, that any information that is required to be collected by a government is going to be private data according to our Data Practices Act. So it's not made public. So with that, Senate File 11 has that extension of included in this tax expenditure, 2 firearm storage units, firearm safety devices, and line 110, that it is a device that when it's installed on a firearm, it's designed to prevent the firearm from being operated without first deactivating that device. Or it is a device that is installed on a firearm that is designed to prevent the operation of the firearm by anybody who doesn't have a right to do that. There gets to be a question about there's some firearms that have that are, when they're purchased, already contain a firearm safety device within the product. And since it is considered a single product, and the intent was not to give a sales tax exemption for firearms in and of themselves, but only to these devices, that is explicitly stated at 119 and 120. And we would be in a bit of, no, we would be in violation of a streamlined sales tax agreement if we tried to include them and separate out the device from the firearm itself. Just the device, just the definition, not the item itself. So that device, that amendment that we had added last year is contained in the last part of that, that definition. So,
Thank
and
you.
it has a fairly, well, no, a very modest impact if you look at the revenue estimate starting in 2025. And I think it's an interesting statistic if you look at the revenue analysis detail, that there are some estimated to be some 337,000 firearms purchased in the state of Minnesota on an annual basis. And the latest statistic is from tax year 2022. And that the department looked at market information that about 3.3% of new gun purchases are accompanied by the purchase of a trigger lock or a cable lock, and that they're assuming that there's about, which is why the cost goes up in the out years, a growth rate of 6.9% during this period. And also, once again, because of the effective date start, for fiscal year 2025, there assumes only 11 months of collection. So I do have an amendment, Mr. Chairman, regarding the repealer.
Okay, very good. Please proceed with that.
Okay, so I'm moving the A1.
Pardon?
Oh, but your amendment is for the next bill, isn't that correct? For Senate File 45?
Oh, that's for the tax expenditure one. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
The,
yeah.
I think of them together, but yes.
Okay.
So this one just has the amendment that we added from Senator Drazkowski last year.
Thank you. Senator Drazkowski, you have a question.
I do thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Rest, about the language on page 2 of the bill. The new language there seems to be at direct odds with the existing statutory language above it. And the part that we wrote last year, or I believe it was last year, Senator Rest, says that a seller is not going to be placed in a position, or I believe it was last year, Senator Rest, says that a seller is not going to be placed in a position to collect or transmit any private or public, to any private or public entity, any personal data or information. And then beginning on the new language on 2.4 through 2.7 says, if the government does collect information about a firearm safety device or firearm storage unit, then it needs to be private or non-public data. So we are essentially telling government there they can collect, or maybe the expectation would be in law that that we are understanding that they're going to be collecting information about these. That's really at direct odds, as I read this, to the existing law above it. Senator Rest, I'd rather have new language there that says a government entity shall not try to collect the data from the individual.
Senator Rest?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Drazkowski, I don't particularly see a difference, and so I wouldn't object to that in particular. And maybe you know this better than I, does the government collect information now on the sale of firearms?
Okay, Ms. Pollack, Senator Drazkowski.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Senator Rest, but we're talking about firearm safety device or firearm storage unit here particularly. And it's not about firearms. So if they are not required to pay sales tax, the question remains, why should government be sticking their nose in and asking questions?
And Mr. Chairman, I think the distinction, and this was your amendment, so I would ask back, why did you think last year that it was sufficient? I don't think the language is any different. And I will look to that.
Madam Senator
I don't
Rest.
believe it's any
Ms.
different.
Pollack has some
Or
information.
Ms. Pollack, is the language different than the Drazkowski amendment from last year?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rest, Senator
And if so, would you explain how it's related to Streamline?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rest, Senator Drazkowski. No, the language is the same from last year. My understanding, and working with our Data Practices Council on this language, is that private entities, so a seller of a firearm safety device or a secure firearm storage unit, those private entities are generally not subject to the Data Practices Act, except where there is a contractual relationship with a government entity. And so this new language starting on 2.3 and 2.4, these sellers would not otherwise be required to transmit any information. The language says if at some point a private seller would be subject to data disclosure requirements about these purchases, then it is private data on individuals or non-public data. So this information generally, like as a matter of principle, private sellers would not be subject to data practices anyway.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Drazkowski, I think there's a protection in this because it's like if there is a bill that would say that information about firearm sales and these devices is in the future going to be available to the government because a bill passes that requires it, this already preempts it for the trigger locks and the cable locks from being taxed. So I think it's, ahead of its time. Not if it is protected from being considered public data. And I think it's preemptive and we should keep it this way.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the discussion, Senator Rest, and I'll continue to talk to you and
Sure.
counsel offline about it.
No
and
problem.
So this has been helpful to me. Thank you.
Okay. We have a testifier on the schedule, Rob Dorr from the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus. Evidently not, okay. With that, are there any further comments or questions? Senator Rest, anything further that you'd like to add?
Not for me.
With that, then, there being no objections, Senate File 11 will be laid over for possible inclusion. Now we will go to Senate File 45, which does have an author's amendment.
Yes, now I had put it in the wrong folder, I'm sorry about that. So, Mr. Chairman, I am here to present Senate File 45, and I have an A1 amendment.
And members, you were handed the A1 amendment earlier, this being an author's amendment and this first stop. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion is carried, amendment is adopted. Senator Rest to the amendment and the underlying bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In 2021, we enacted a law that established the LBO, the Legislative Budget Office, and also the Legislative Commission to review tax expenditures. So this bill reflects the work done by the LBO and then makes some streamlining, I would say, changes in the law that we passed. And I want, when I go through them, I think they'll be considered relatively minor or stylistic changes until we get to the repealer. And that's, I'll want to explain that more. So, one of the changes that we've undertaken at the on the TURC, on the Tax Expenditure Review Commission, and Senator Klein and Senator Drazkowski and Senator Weber are 4 members from the Minnesota Senate, 2 from each party. There's a similar committee membership or commission membership on the House side, 2 from each party, and then so it's bicameral, bipartisan, and then there is a tie-breaking vote, if there ever needs to be one, to be cast by the Commissioner of Revenue. So in the first part of it, we, in the terms of the definitions, we define that in lines 110, that commissioner does mean the Commissioner of Revenue. And then we don't allow legislative members to be part of a commission, I don't think anywhere, that allows them to designate an alternate at any time. But we thought it was a good practice to allow the Commissioner of Revenue, because of his schedule, that he could designate, and this does happen on other commissions, a member of the Department of Revenue's administration to represent the commissioner at meetings and to at any time, and it doesn't have to be the same person. It may be, for example, if he's unable to attend, the current commissioner is unable to attend, and maybe at that commission meeting, we are taking up tax expenditures that have to do with income tax, that the department's expert or staff in income tax might be the person who sits in the commissioner's place. The Department of Revenue routinely attends our commission meetings and often provides valuable extra information about the tax expenditure that is under consideration. For years, a statute that says every new bill that proposes a tax expenditure has to be accompanied by a purpose statement. The Senate in the conference committee has never voted for that. The motion has never come up because there has never been or any members of the Senate, either party, that has thought that we need anything other than the plain language of the statute to indicate its purpose. And so on the Turk, what we have done is to talk a lot about the definitions of identifying all kinds of information about a tax expenditure, and have chosen the word objective, which is a more neutral term. Purpose has a moral undertone, and we want that the objective, the sense was that does not have that kind of moral undertone. And so we need to change the statute to reflect what the Turk right now is doing itself. And we changed the responsibility for identifying the objective from the legislature to the Turk itself. So that language is part of the repealer. Also, we have found that it is very challenging to prepare the annual report from the LBO on the Turk by December, and they have asked, and I think reasonably so, that the date of that report, which we just heard last week, from December to February. So that change is made on page 2, lines 22. The rest of the changes there, if you'll look through it time and time again, are the definition or change the word purpose to objective to reflect the actual practice of the Turk at this point. And again, the report to the legislature from the Turk that is prepared by the LBO would come February 15th of each year. Oh, and going back to the commissioner, when the members originally presented and we passed the legislation, one of the things that happens with the establishment of new commissions is that the author leaves out an important, if minor, detail, and that is no way to call a commission into order or to set a date. And so this bill designates that the Commissioner of Revenue will be given the annual responsibility of calling the first meeting. And then at that meeting, and the chairmanship goes back and forth between the two houses. For 2025, it is the responsibility of the House of Representatives. In 2024, it was the Senate's responsibility. I was the chair of it, and Representative Badge was the vice chair. So the commissioner is required to call the first meeting, and the commissioner may have a designee in his or her absence at a hearing. And that the commissioner having the responsibility of convening the first meeting is each year is found on page 4, line 10. Then the amendment, or the bill is introduced, repealed 3.192, and if we look on page 1R, that's where the purpose statements were originally included. They've now been changed to a statement of objectives that is undertaken by the Turk itself rather than a bill. And and tax expenditure itself has been redefined inside the statute. However, in looking at this is the question before about Senator Klein, about, Mr. Chairman, about the expiration of a tax expenditure, and that it is not preferable to repeal that part of it as well, and to keep that sunset provision on new tax expenditures or the continuation of a tax expenditure that has expired as part of the statute. And so only A and B are proposed here to be removed with the A1 amendment.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Questions or comments? Seeing none, any further comment from you, Senator? With that, Senate File 45 as amended will be laid over for possible inclusion.
Okay, members, our last bill up for the day is Senate File 49. The author is Senator Weber. Senator Weber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a bill that I had introduced and that we had dealt with last year as well. What this bill does is that it essentially provides that property that when it is exempt from property taxes, if it is leased, loaned, or otherwise used by an individual, association, or corporation for profitable purposes, that at that point, that property becomes taxable. And what this would do is it would take land that is leased for grazing purposes and would allow it to be leased for those purposes and still maintain its property tax exemption. Now, typically, we are concerned always about exempting property from property taxes because we all know that when you do that, it creates a shift onto other properties. However, in this, for instance, number one, the number of acres we're talking about is very good possibility that leased for grazing purposes. In recent years, we have the agricultural practices have developed the concept that rotational grazing is actually beneficial for grassland. If you allow it just to simply grow and die back, grow and die back, it actually inhibits the growth of the of the grasses that are there. And by having rotational grazing, and that would be, you know, on a relatively minor part of the grazing season, it actually enhances and habilitates the grassland acres. And so you will see in Senate File 49, basically the changes are made in lines 2.19 to 2.22, which then grants the ability to lease the land, and then the effective date on 3.4 and 5. With that, Mr. Chair, that is my bill, and if anyone has any questions. If not, I do have with me today a testifier from the Nature Conservancy who will introduce himself and present his presentation.
Thank you, Senator Weber. I don't see any questions now. If we can go ahead with Mr. Kaplan. If you'd introduce yourself for the record, Mr. Kaplan, please proceed.
Well, thank you, Senator Weber, and good morning, Chair Rest and committee members. My name is Steve Chaplin. I'm the Prairie Conservation Coordinator for the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota. The Nature Conservancy is a nonprofit organization working to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. Now, one of the ways that we do that in Minnesota is through the protection and restoration of native prairie grasslands. Unfortunately, less than 2% of Minnesota's native prairie grasslands remain, but they have significant benefits for carbon sequestration, water quality, wildlife habitat, endangered species conservation, and others. I'm here today to speak in support of Senate File 49, which would help the Nature Conservancy conduct prairie management on certain tax-exempt lands by enabling the use of cattle grazing by private ranchers as a conservation tool. Cattle grazing is an important component in maintaining the health and vigor of our state's grasslands and is widely recognized as a cost-effective tool for prairie management. Targeted conservation grazing is generally very limited in both space and duration, and when strategically employed, helps control invasive species and contributes to healthy prairie soils and prairie rejuvenation. Now, one of the greatest threats to our prairies is the invasion of cool season non-native grasses. Limited duration grazing early and late in the growing season is one of the best techniques we have for keeping invasive grasses at bay. Now, we've been engaged in recent years with individual cattle producers and state and federal agencies to develop plans to meet management goals and provide additional access for cattle producers to graze on public and Nature Conservancy lands. In addition to facilitating this collaboration, the Nature Conservancy has invested heavily in fencing and water infrastructure on public and TNC lands, and an effort that has resulted in expanding the acres of grass available to private cattle ranchers. Now, while we've made good progress with respect to public lands, current law stipulates that any tax-exempt lands that are available to a for-profit business, those lands are subject to property taxes for that year. Because conservation grazing does not occur every year, and when it does occur, is usually of short duration, for-profit ranchers are usually unwilling to pay enough to cover the tax burden that would result. An exemption to open these tax-exempt properties to grazing to further conservation objectives enables private ranchers to graze their cattle on these tax-exempt grasslands while benefiting both the producer and the conservation organization. Senate File 49 would enable us to conduct rotational, ecologically driven grazing on TNC parcels and provide increased forage to private cattle producers. Because these lands are already tax exempt, Senate File 49 would be effectively revenue neutral to counties and other local units of government. Adopting this bill will provide a win-win solution for conservation and agriculture. We greatly appreciate this committee's past work on this proposal. Thank you, Chairs Weber and Rest and committee members for the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kaplan. Senator Barr, I believe, has a question, then Senator Rest. Senator Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 3 or 4 really quick questions. Do we lease any of this land now currently to private cattle ranchers?
On the
Mr.
tax
Kaplan.
exempt,
Mr. Kaplan.
sorry. We don't currently, on the lands that are tax exempt, graze those properties.
Senator Barr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if this bill passes and you do start the grazing, which I agree with, that's not a question here, how would you determine which ranchers get to use this and where, the follow-up question would be, how much would you charge? How would you decide how much you're charging the private rancher to graze on this land? And where would any monies that are generated be deposited in which fund?
Mr. Chaplin?
Thank you. Senator Barr, in general, the people that graze our property are usually neighbors, because we're usually talking about short duration grazing, and that we can't, they're not willing, and we can't charge very much rent for that kind of grazing. And so what it usually means is that a neighbor can open a fence and allow his cattle to go out and do our property. So in most cases, that'll work out. Others, in a very few cases, we'll open it up to bid, anybody that would want to bring cattle in, but I can't remember of an instance where that has actually happened. And for how much it's usually, what we'll start at whatever the current market rate is for it, but we give allowances for maintaining fences, having to put in any new infrastructure. For maintaining fences, having to put in any new infrastructure. Most cases, it becomes almost a wash, that there's not very much cash that exchanges hands, simply because that by the time they put the needed infrastructure they need in the way of fencing or water supplies, that eats up most of what they would wind up paying.
Senator Barr?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So if I'm understanding this correctly, the rent would be paid, and as opposed to dollars, it would be in maintaining the common fence and things like that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Chaplin?
All right. Thank you.
Senator Barr? Thank you, Mr. Chaplin. Thank you, Senator Barr. Senator Rest?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kaplan, our custom is to always address the chair first before you address
I'm
another
sorry.
member, and for the members to also address the chair first before they address a member. I'm just curious, Mr. Kaplan or Senator Weber, is this a common practice in other states that have a similar program?
Senator Weber? Mr. Chaplin?
That you know of, Mr. Chairman, Senator Weber?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rest, I'm not aware of the practice in other states. I don't know if Mr. Chaplin is or not.
No, I'm not either.
I think that one of the issues that presents itself, and that I was willing to author this bill, is that what we do see is that we have a shortage of grazing property for cattle producers in my area. The county, for example, in which the Nature Conservancy owns probably the largest percentage of land of in any of my counties, and I represent all or parts of 9. They have a need for grazing availability, and so this provision really allows that to happen. And quite frankly, much of that land would not be available for grazing, and thus even for real estate taxes without a measure like this.
Senator Rest?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Weber. I support this, but I think it's also on other bills that come forward that want to diminish the level of property tax on value and move it from one jurisdiction or one type of owner or property and keep the same money, but then spread it spread it on other property owners. And I'm really impressed that the effect of spreading it to the burden otherwise of this property is negligible, or at most $5,000 of value is actually moved to other properties, which is almost the same as being negligible or zero. So happy to support it once again.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Senator Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Weber, for carrying this bill. This is yet another example of how agriculture can contribute to conservation and how our agricultural economy contributes to a better, more sustainable Minnesota. And so I want to thank you for carrying the bill and also lend my support to it and ask if I can sign on if you're amenable.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Putnam. Any other questions, members? Senator Weber, closing comments.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think everything that needs to be said has been said.
Thank you, Senator Weber. And members, seeing no further discussion, Senate File 49 will be laid over for potential inclusion. Any announcements from either of the two co-chairs?
Mr. Chair, we will have 5 bills on the agenda for tomorrow, and we will just keep plugging away.
Senator Rest? Okay, seeing none, members, we will be meeting again tomorrow morning, same place, 8:30 a.m., 22nd of January. Meeting's adjourned.